Changeworking, moving minds for change that lasts.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Changeworking, a show for practitioners and coaches who help their clients create change. My name is Ruckus, and as always, I'll be in conversation with James Tripp. Today, we're talking about showmanship and performance. Now, if you are a hypnotist, or perhaps even an NLP practitioner, this may be an area of interest to you already. But for many of you who practice coaching or talk therapy style frameworks, this may be something you previously haven't considered. So I'm hoping you'll find this conversation interesting and perhaps come to consider that the way you deliver a message might be every bit as important as what the message is. So here's my conversation with James about showmanship and performance in Changework.
I do genuinely believe that people who understand performance make better hypnotists. And I used to get this years ago when I would teach hypnosis. Half the people in the room knew me from the world of magic and mentalism, and they would come in that way. And then half the people in the room were sort of in therapy and psychotherapy, this kind of thing. And they just didn't pick up the hypnosis very easily at all. All the card magicians and stuff, they'd never done hypnosis before, but they understood performance. They understood things about conveying stuff in an impactful way. So I think there's something of the performer in there, which is a huge thing. And there's a book, and it's called The Death and Resurrection Show. And it's by an anthropologist who points out that the roots of showmanship and performance lay with shamanism. So that shaman have always been performers, and show business comes from shamanism. And he's got this kind of line, which is shamanism becomes show business when the performer and the audience stop taking the same drug, metaphorically speaking. So when the performer believes it, they perform, but they sort of impel something in their performance. They evoke things in their performance, and they believe fully they're 100% congruent with that performance. When they stop being a shaman, become a showman, now they know that what they're conveying isn't real anymore. But the skills of it are still the same. If you look at like a good performer, it's the same. I mean, you're involved in movies and film and stuff like this, right? So you want to evoke stuff into people watching the movie. The story's got to work a certain way. The dialogue's got to work a certain way to hook people in, to evoke things in them. My mark of a good movie is, do I think about it afterwards? Right? It's not even how much am I enjoying it at the time. It's like afterwards, do I walk out of that cinema and never think of that movie again? Or do things keep coming up in my mind? Now, if things keep coming up in my mind, that movie changed me some way. Because I'm thinking differently now. I'm seeing things differently. I'm considering things differently. It's had an impact. So I do believe that a lot, and particularly if you go back and you look at the history of hypnotism, you read back, you see things that, say, James Braid was doing, or James Esdale, or any of these old people from back in the day. They didn't think of themselves as giving suggestions. They fully immersed themselves in a kind of ritual, but they wouldn't think of it that way. And it was the impact of the whole experience that seemed to have the curative effect. These people were doctors. They kept case studies. They kept rigorous case studies. And many of them went in skeptically minded. So they weren't there just trying to justify it. They're going, wow, Braid particularly, he thought it was all fakery when he first started to investigate it, and ended up being a prolific proponent and having some strange ideas about how it worked. But what he did know is it did work. And he kept these case studies, and you look at these case studies and there's crazy stuff happening. Now, later on, Braid's talking about a particular kind of nervous sleep that, enables inner healing to take place and all of this. And maybe there's something of that in the mix. But later on, he changed his mind and basically said, no, it's all down to suggestion. So, if you think about this, these suggestionists, these later hypnotists in the later 1800s, and now today everyone is a suggestionist. Suggestion comes in many forms. It's not just the words you say, it's the movement you make, it's the tonality, it's your presence, it's everything you bring in a sense to the performance. So good hypnotists tend to be good performers. If you look at Bandler, if you go back and look at videos of Bandler in the early 80s and Bandler now, Bandler at different points, his voice changes, a lot changes about who he is. There's a lot that stays the same, but there's quite a significant difference. And to me, I always respected that because I thought, well, this is a guy who's about changing yourself. And I can see differences in him. Whereas John Grinder, love his brain. I love to hear him think. Frank Puslik said it's always a privilege to listen to John Grinder speak because you get to listen to John Grinder think. And he has some wonderful connections he makes and all of this kind of thing. But he's always John Grinder, and he's not really much of a performer. And how he speaks when he's being kind of more in his sort of, he's a charismatic academic, I think, but he's definitely an academic in a sense. And he doesn't change that persona when he does hypnosis. So it's like getting hypnotized by a college lecturer or something, which is what he is. That's what he was originally.
When you've seen Bandler, when you've trained with him, did you see a shift? Did you see off stage Bandler and on stage Bandler?
Oh, I've seen off stage, on stage Bandler. There's a difference there.
I thought was really interesting about the performance aspect. And we already recorded a podcast where we talked for a moment about that idea of playing one across instead of one up, which is sort of the flip side of that, which I find very interesting. So this idea of the differences between the prestige hypnotist or playing one across, or is that different?
I'm going to just say, on the surface, it can look like those ideas are in contradiction with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to suggest that they're not.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that somebody can't be being a flamboyant, showman type or show person type and playing one up. They most certainly can, and that's not uncommon. See, I don't think Erickson played one up at all. I think Erickson was a one across player, 100%. But my goodness, was he a performer?
Mm-hmm.
He would create an atmosphere, a feeling, a sense in the space. He would look at people with a twinkle in his eye and suggest meaningfulness around certain things. There's a whole rich, immersive, co-creative performance that someone like Erickson's engaging with. And I don't think it's one up at all. I think Erickson's a real one across guy. And I do think Erickson actually has got a fair ego on him, but I think he keeps it so far in the background and so quiet that nobody would ever really see it. I think he probably quietly thinks he knows a thing or two, or thought he knew a thing or two. But I think generally speaking, when it comes to his client work, I think Erickson was largely a one across player. He was even willing to play one down positions. He might play one up positions occasionally, but he would do it all consciously and strategically. It wasn't like being caught in that habitual high status play.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about that idea of performance and being a performer. And what would be some ways you could, if you want to maybe start exploring some ways to become more of a performer for efficacy reasons, for what are reasons where adding a little performance is going to help the client more so than just a straight, what are some ways that would be worth exploring for?
I think on the most simple level, there's a distinction that I often draw, which is information versus evocation.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people think about communication in terms of information. What is the information that I want to get across? And so they explain things and they tell things and they do all this sort of thing. And that's fine. It does what it does everything that it does and nothing that it doesn't. Hypnosis for me is a much more rich, multidimensional art of moving minds, directing attention, leading cognition, seeding ideas. So sometimes there are things where you want to really bring some awareness to something. You want to bring some reverence to something. You'll see. Now, I don't want to say like, oh yeah, I'm a performer. I'm not, apart from what I'm doing and looking and going, oh, here's a place where I could do a performance piece. But I do performance pieces all the time. I'll bet if you watch the demos, I bet there are times when the client will say a particular thing, which will be a resource popping through, and I'll go, this is a guess, by the way, I'll go, like that,
mm-hmm.
right? And I'm just marking that as significant. And that's a pure performance piece. It's a sound. I haven't said anything. It's a sound and a body motion and a facial expression. So it's all nonverbal. And it's in the realm of performance. So another example, if I go back and I look at some of the street hypnosis stuff that I used to do, see, I really used to do a lot of performance in that. And there's a certain principle that I talk about in the Hypnosis Without Trance book, which I call witch doctoring at the time. So interesting now we're talking about shaman and witch doctors and performers and this kind of thing. So I might be going to do something where I get somebody to take hold of a card or a coin or something like that. And I say, okay, let's do something. Are you left or right-handed?
Right-handed.
And they go, right-handed or whatever, right? And I say, okay, do this with your, actually, we'll do this with your right hand. Now, that whole bit was, I was going to do it with the same hand anyway, because I tend to use the same hand over and over because I'm just making my life easy. But I'm doing a little bit of pantomime there that suggests that I'm doing an evaluation. And the implication of the fact that I'm doing an evaluation is that I'm paying attention to subtle things and there's deeper meaning going on. And all of this is implied by this little piece of performance. You know, and it kind of hooks people in, and it also creates a sort of process to engage with, and I can look at how they're responding. So all of that is a good example of a performance piece. Or sometimes I might be just using my tone differently. So if I'm doing head, heart, and gut, for example, I might go, so what does your head know? And when your head knows this, what does your heart know? What do you feel there? So there's a performance quality to that because I want to change the energy. I want to direct attention differently. So all of these non-verbal elements come in. That's easier for some people than others. Some people take to that more easily. They attend to those sorts of things more easily. And some people are quite intimidated by doing that because they go, oh no, I feel uncomfortable being anything other than myself. Right? Now, I never like to make hard rules about anything. So I would never say to somebody, well, if you're uncomfortable being anything other than yourself, staying within your existing repertoire of behaviors and this sort of thing, I wouldn't want to say that someone can't do good work from there, because I might be wrong about that and they might find a way of making that work. But I do believe that people who are willing to step beyond who they think they are and how they think they are generally have more option in how they can lead people. The other thing about this as well, by the way, is people mark out significant events in their mind, right? Things that stand out. A big influence on me is a guy called Ed Jacobs, who's got an approach to therapy or counseling called impact therapy. And his point is, if you don't have impact, if you don't do things that are slightly odd or bizarre or weird or whatever, things that mark things out, then you lose impact in therapy. And he's not a hypnotist or anything like that. I believe he's got some influence from Erickson, but not really the hypnotic end, more the strategic end. If you sit down, you're doing change work with somebody, and it just seems like a conversation, right? If it fits the bill for a conversation, an everyday advice-based conversation, something like that, then nothing particularly unusual happened. The only thing that was perhaps unusual is maybe they hadn't met you before, or maybe they'd not sat in this room before, but it was just all in the conversational space. So David Grove would call this quadrant one. He had this 4-quadrant model. He'd call this quadrant one. It's just conversational, everyday stuff. You can work in that space. You can still drop suggestions in. You can direct attention, lead cognition, and seed ideas. But the overall frame is we're having a conversation. Quadrant 2, if we use Grove's model, he called going psychoactive, right? And at this point, basically, it means going weird. Now we're in the realm of the strange. You know, we're not in Kansas anymore. We're doing something different. And it's marked. And sometimes you can explicitly do that. You might go, okay, so I think it's time we did a little hypnosis, if you're good with that, right? You might mark it overtly. Or it might mean that you just start to kind of lead things out and shift the boundaries and slow things down and let a certain atmosphere emerge within the conversation, which is what I tend to do a lot of the time when I'm working with the rocks recovery work I do, because I'm not known as a hypnotist there, so I don't get to explicitly frame as hypnosis. That's why I like that metaphor of trance as WD-40. You just squeeze a bit into the mechanism here and there, just get everything running more smoothly. So all of this is, it's a kind of performance thing. You're creating impact through performance pieces, through making this different.
As I was thinking about, ideally, this podcast is for change workers, including coaches who haven't necessarily been trained in hypnosis. I'm curious about that idea of, traditional coaches, it's more of just conversational talking. And I have the confidence that if someone who's just, even who've been doing coaching for a long time, just learned some hypnotic language, how much more effective they would be,
right,
et cetera. And I'm wondering about performance separately from that. Like, if you're a coach and not a hypnotist and you're getting decent results, but you want to get better, like, how much time spending on performance?
Well, this is a really good question. Now, one of the most impactful human beings in my life is a guy called Steve Chandler, who always billed himself pretty much as a coach, often as a life coach. He has a book, one of his many books, called The Life Coaching Connection. But he's never studied hypnosis and doesn't think about things in terms of hypnosis. And maybe he's picked some stuff up, but I don't really think that's where Steve comes from. I love best being coached by Steve, and I love Steve live. There's something a little bit Bill Murray about him. He's got a sort of dry sense of humor. He's funny, and he's really impactful. He is a writer. He was a writer first, so he thinks about things from a writer's sensibility, but he's also a performer. And I remember him saying to me one time, I think I'd said to him, "What do you do to prepare for your coaching weekends?" He said, "I know my coaching repertoire inside out. So all I do is the night before I watch all my favorite comedians." So for him, that was the valuable piece to put him in the zone, in that zone of being someone that could show up and move people, and so he's a funny guy. So comedy is a huge thing for him. Now, I'm talking about hypnosis. My biases come from my experience doing hypnosis, being a hypnotist. But if my experience was as a stand-up comedian, I would probably talk about similar things in that sense, in that way. Stand-up comedians, they're running feedback loops with their audience. They're thinking about the timing of things, the performance, how to get that laugh rather than just put something out flat. A good orator, somebody that stands in front and delivers a powerful, engaging keynote speech, they're performers as well. Rhetoricians, they're performers as well. Look at someone like Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, even if you weren't listening to the words, your hairs would go up on the back of your neck. Or at least that's speaking for me, because there's a guy that knows how to move people. Now, when I say that's a performance, I don't mean, sometimes people take that to mean, oh, well, that's superficial. It's just a superficial thing. A good performance is anything but superficial. It's an immersion. So I think that even if someone's a coach, it's starting to think about the richer dimensions of communication, whether you think about it in terms of hypnosis or rhetoric or poetry or anything. I mean, what's poetry? Poetry is about moving people, about evoking things. If you start thinking about what are the different ways I can impact somebody with my communication that go beyond simply this idea I want to share. Right? Or if I'm going to share an idea, if I were to share it informationally, that would be one thing. If I were to share it in a way that hooked people in, lit up neural networks more, created a little bit more space or feeling in the moment, how might I go about doing that? And by the way, hypnotic languaging really helps with that. But if you deliver it dry like a robot, it's less useful. Do you know the Meisner method, Sanford Meisner, acting coach?
The acting? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. I think that his method, if I remember rightly, I got into reading various books on acting methods years ago, Because to me, it's all the same: acting, performing, hypnosis, evoking, change work, showmanship, and shamanism. It's the same kind of ballpark. A lot of overlap skills. I believe he used to encourage people to just learn their lines in a really dry and robotic way. But he didn't encourage people to deliver them in a dry and robotic way. He would encourage people to have the robot script and then bring it to life in the moment according to what was coming through in the moment, which is different from some method where you might figure out what your motivations are and really rehearse the emotions. So he would have it that you didn't rehearse all of that stuff. You just allowed that to come through live, which made it alive. Hypnotic language is really useful and can be learned in that way, dry and robotic, but then you might figure out how you want to deliver it. So I could say to you, how would it be if you were to realize there's so much more to you than you have ever realized? Okay, bunch of words. Or I could say to you, I'm curious. How would it be right now if you were to come to realize fully that there is so much more to you than you could ever have possibly realized? And I wonder what might be possible for you within all of that. Right? Now, if I say something in that way, right? Now, like out of context, it's like, well, but obviously you're kind of pacing and leading people into the vibe. But I didn't say exactly the same words as I said the first time, but they were largely similar words.
Right.
Right. So yes, the hypnotic language is incredibly useful because I could do simpler non-hypnotic language and still put that feeling in, and it would be valuable, but it wouldn't have the same mechanisms that are hidden inside of the hypnotic language version. Like if I said to you, you are so much more than you have ever realized. You might go, well, I don't know about that. I mean, maybe not. Because you can directly argue with that. Is it true? Is it not true?
Mm-hmm.
But if I say, I wonder how it would be for you if you were to realize in this moment that, right? All that front end means that that's the stuff you're thinking about, is it or isn't so? But the later message comes in, just gets delivered straight under the radar. You're not debating the next bit that I'm going to say after that, which is going to be the suggestion that I'm looking to offer you for your inner mind to create goodness with.
Okay, so you're a hypnotist. You've been doing it for a while. You feel like you're pretty good. You're constantly, what's the next training I should take? Hypnosis training. What's the next NLP training? And I wonder if someone in that position said, what if I spent 6 weeks doing nothing but studying acting or professional oratory,
Yeah.
And how much of a difference that would make as compared to studying a new changework technique?
I think it'll make a huge difference. And when we started this conversation, which was, I think, before the recording was running, you were asking me about various trainings that I'd done, and I mentioned various changework trainings, NLP trainings, hypnosis trainings. What I didn't mention was that I did improv theater with no intention of ever being a professional performing improviser. But again, for me, that was about performance, and it was about live improvised performance, being able to kind of create with what comes up is the term that I like to use. That was incredibly valuable for me. Another thing that I did is looking at it from a performance perspective. I did Toastmasters for about 2 years. And Toastmasters is kind of interesting because it gives you an opportunity to stand up in front of people and deliver stuff and move minds. Now, a lot of the time when I was doing the Toastmaster stuff, I was figuring out strategies and tactics for running a lot of NLP stuff into public speaking. But I was also taking that opportunity to really perform as a public speaker. So it's definitely early on for me when I was developing myself in NLP changework stuff. I was also an NLP trainer. So my intention initially wasn't to be predominantly a coach or a changework practitioner. It was to be an NLP trainer. That's what I really wanted to be. So like, I want to stand up. I want to move the minds of people in a room. So there was a lot of practice. And at that time, I read a lot of books on acting and showmanship and these kinds of things. There's a wonderful book I love, an old book called Magic and Showmanship by Henning Nelms. And just this idea about what do you want to create in people? What's the shift? What's the impact? How do you want to hook people in? You know, if you want somebody to experience, you know, I know, just experience a shudder down their spine. You know, how do you evoke that through your communication? So I think there's incredible value in all of that stuff. And yeah, I would definitely advocate it. But I'm always wary that there might be people listening going, oh, but that doesn't appeal to me. That doesn't seem like who I am, or I don't feel like that, or I don't ever want to say to somebody, this is what you must do to be an effective agent of change. Obviously, I've got my biases. Obviously, I've got things that I value. But I also do know that it's true that often I go, oh, this is what makes a great Changework practitioner. And then one day I'll see somebody who breaks all those rules and apparently gets great change. So we all have our biases. I do not think it hurts people to recognize that communication is not just a string of words. If we go beyond that, it's like, okay, what is everything else to communication? So you will never be harmed by enriching your skills in communication as a coach, Changework practitioner, therapist, whatever.
I was thinking about when my wife and I have been teaching screenwriting classes for a long time, and there was a distinct moment where we taught a class, and then it was 6 months later we taught a class, and in between I had done a very deep dive on hypnosis when I had started really actually properly learning. And after the second class, I was like, the students were so much more engaged, and like we just had a great round of students. And then I started analyzing and realized how much hypnotic language I had actually just included my entire way I was presenting the same material through a different lens now, and hadn't even realized it till later when I analyzed it. And the class was, as far as here's how to write characters, here's how to do dialogue, that was all the same, but the way I presented it was totally different.
Right.
And I know the results were so much better for the students. They learned it better.
You know, I think there's this line, and I've mentioned this in 100 places in public before, so maybe people have heard me say this before. But Bander and Grinder, when they modeled Erickson's language use, and they published that in the Patterns of Milton H. Erickson, Volume 1, Volume 2, supposedly Erickson was kind of critical about this in Erickson's way. He allegedly said, and I love this line, this demonstrates Erickson's humor. He said, "Bandit and swindler really cracked the nut on my work. The trouble is they took the shell but left the nut." Now, it could be easy to see that as a complete diss, you know, a complete blowing up. But if you think of the metaphor of shell and nut, I think that's exactly what they did, is they took the shell and left the nut. And I think in fairness to Banner and Grinder, they weren't interested in the nut. They were interested in the shell. And the shell is the delivery system. So what you're talking about is your nut didn't change. You had the same nut that you wanted to deliver, but the shell, the new shell, the hypnotic language shell, enabled you to deliver it much more effectively to the rich soil that it needed to go to. You know, so I think that's a huge thing. And I had a similar experience years ago. I was a martial arts teacher and Qigong teacher as well. So I teach Chinese martial arts and Qigong. And this is early 2000s. And I've been really studying hypnotic language, like really heavily. But I was really reluctant to use it because at the time I was afraid of being weird. I had this thing that was holding me back. Oh, if I start talking funny, people will think I'm weird. But I've been studying it and studying it and studying it, practicing it, writing out patterns, this kind of thing. And I got frustrated with myself. I thought, are you going to do this, or are you just going to keep studying it? I thought, all right, it's time to do it. And I decided I would do it in one of the Tai Chi classes I was running. So that would start off with some Nigong, some Chamshong. It's called standing meditation. And I'd taken people through this, I don't know, 100 times before, hundreds of times, in a particular way. And now I thought I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but it's going to be all Milton language, pacing and leading, everything like this. So I did this standing meditation, which takes around about 20 minutes to go through. There's 6 positions or 8 positions if you include the start and the finish. And when I finished and I kind of brought everybody back into the space, there was a guy who was over, I would stand in front of the group. He was on the far left-hand side of the line, a guy called Ian. And he came down, he went, whoa, that was the most intense Qigong experience I've ever had. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I said to him, did you notice me doing anything different? He went, no. And that was really good for me because I was worried that these weird language structures and stuff would be marked out as weird. But I think what happened is he got so drawn into the experience, he wasn't actually paying attention to the words themselves. He was caught in the experience that the languaging was creating. So it was a really good lesson for me in 2 ways. Number one, in the, oh my goodness me, this stuff actually really works. And also in the fact that it's not as obvious when doing it as one might think it was, or as certainly as much as I feared it was. Anyway, it sounds like a similar experience from what you're talking about.
Yeah. Even on the smallest level, it's the, analog marking of certain words. When I was learning that, basic hypnosis, I kind of just feels so artificial, but I found I was doing that all the time in the classes.
Right.
And it's just a practice. It's just practice. You gotta sound artificial for a little bit until you get used to doing it.
Yeah.
And then later you get to the point where you don't even realize you're doing it, but you know when it's appropriate and when it's useful to do it.
I suspect, I don't know, I could be wrong about this, but people probably do actually analog mark naturally and not even realize they do it.
Mm-hmm.
So you're probably just enhancing something that's naturally there. But when you first do it, you become aware of it yourself and go, oh, is that?
Right.
But you might have been doing it anyway. Or maybe not. Maybe people don't naturally analog mark.
No, I probably do in certain ways, but it's the sort of artifice of it at first of like, oh, I'm going to stop on a word when I normally wouldn't. I don't know if you ever, I don't know if there's anything to do with it, but Clint Eastwood as a performer will stop in the middle of a sentence for no apparent reason. And it's always, I was like, is he analog marking for some reason? When I learned analog marking, I started paying attention to Clint Eastwood for some reason. It's almost like he's either running out of breath or he's purposely landing on a certain word. Certain performers do that. Christopher Walken has the oddest way of stopping on a certain word.
Yeah.
I've heard his, sort of the tale about him is that he'll go through and remove all the punctuation from his dialogue so that he's never completing it because he wants to keep it fresh and stop on a different word every time. For whatever that's worth, that's an interesting performance thing, I find.
Yeah, I think there's something that, I don't know if this is a phrase that I came up with or if I heard it somewhere or whatever, what's called an anticipation hook. So, you can start to say something and then you just pick a point where you create a little bit more space, and then people are hanging on for the completion of what you're doing, and that can sort of draw people in a little bit more. So I believe there's value in that, in the spaces that you leave, the pauses that you leave. There's sort of spaces that have people, it draws people forward, rather than if you're just machine gunning a bunch of words at somebody, it's almost like it's knocking them backwards. And I reckon there's something to that beyond just analog marking.
And even thinking of, you're hanging out with your friends at dinner or having a beer and you want to tell a funny story. I've noticed myself playing with that, of just the analog marking of certain words. And even just shuffling around. Okay, I know here's sort of the payoff, the punchline. And if I reshuffle the order of the details to get to the punchline, how does that land differently when I tell the story to someone else? And I think about that in terms of leading a process that has a certain number of steps. And what if I change the order of those? Just thinking of it purely as performance, does that, I don't know if I could separate that out from the way it affects cognition, but just as the performance of it, saying words in certain order. I don't know if there's anything in there, but I think about that often.
I think there is. I think, anything, if you start paying attention to what makes difference in communication and getting interested in people and who does what and how they do what. I mean, we were talking earlier about hypnosis versus oration versus whatever.
Mhm.
Even if you take raconteurs, those people that are just casually good at telling a great story versus somebody else, you're at a party and people take turns sharing anecdotes. And you get some people that really share an anecdote and they draw people in.
Mhm.
And then you get other people who are not great at sharing anecdotes. And maybe they're trying to rush through the anecdote. Maybe they're acting as if, I don't really want to impose, so I'll get through my anecdote quickly. Or, there are so many different ways that people can share just a personal story even. I've actually, talking about performance, people that do these kind of story jams and things like this. So I've read some books by story jammers as well, what their opinions are on how do you tell a good personal story to get people hooked in. So any ideas that you get. And I really recommend exploring with different things. I'd read this book called Hypnosis. And one of the things that introduced me to was the idea that even certain sounds evoke things in people, right? The classic example of this is if you've got, a lactating mother hears someone else's baby crying, they get like a letdown response or something from the breast milk, right? People respond to sounds. People respond to babies crying in certain ways. There's certain noises that have certain effects at a pre-verbal level. So there's a whole bit in there. And I'd read this, and I had the ideas fresh in my mind. And in the town I used to live in, Letchworth Garden City, I used to go to the Rock Fryer and get fish and chips once a week. Terribly unhealthy, but I'd go there and I'd get my fish and chips. And there was often not parking spaces. So you park up on the pavement, on the sidewalk, sometimes, and it was kind of fine. There was a big sidewalks. Lots of people did it. But if you got caught, you're going to get a parking ticket. But you're only going to be there literally to go in. It's 3 minutes in the place. So people take the chance. I took the chance. There's a little bit more of a line in the Rock Fryer than usual. And someone came in and said, has anyone here got a blue Peugeot estate? I said, yeah, I do. He said, well, you're getting a ticket right now. I was like, oh, fuck. So I rushed out and the guy's writing the ticket out on the pad. And I just ran up to him and I just read this Hypnosis and I just went, oh. That's all I did is I kind of screwed up my face in mock pain and made this sound, this anguished sound, and held my hands up, right? Oh. And he looked at me and he went, well, you're parked on the pavement. And I just went, oh. And repeated it again. And he looked at me again. He went, oh, well, don't do it again. Right? And pulled the thing off the pad. Now, when I told this story, somebody said, no, that's not true. I said, no, it is true. He said, no, it's not, because when they start to write that out, they have to finish it because they're numbered and they can't write that out. But that is what happened. So that kind of increased the impact for me as I actually got him to do something he was absolutely not supposed to do. But I didn't use there were no clever language patterns, anything like that. It was purely just this parody of pain and anguish that he couldn't argue with on any kind of conscious level because I had no content to argue with. He could only respond to. And I think that's one of the things about the non-verbal aspects of the communication is people respond, but they can never argue. You cannot argue with non-verbals. You can only respond to them, right? So if you think about it in hypnosis terms, if you take that Ellman idea that hypnosis is about bypassing the critical faculty, well, the critical faculty needs something to get its teeth into. It needs ideas. It needs to argue against something. Right? You can't argue against a sound or a change in rhythm or tone or anything like that. There's nothing to debate. So I like to think that stuff automatically bypasses the quote-unquote conscious mind or the critical faculty or whatever you want to call it. So valuable stuff.
Now, I'm curious in that specific instance, as you're walking towards the guy giving the ticket, was this a conscious thought? I'm going to try this, or did it just happen?
No, it wasn't. It just happened because I've been thinking a lot about the idea. And there was something else alongside of it is there's a book by Jerry Spence, who was a trial lawyer, and he's supposedly a legend in the field. And he wrote a book called How to Argue and Win Every Time. And I bought this book, I think around a similar-ish time that I got Hypnosis. And I was expecting this book in all these clever arguments and all of this. And most of the book was just about emotions and evoking emotions and about unfettering yourself to be emotional and speak in emotional ways. He had exercises like go somewhere where you feel that you might be caught, but there aren't a lot of people around, and make loud animal sounds. Make the sound of the wolf. Make the roar of the tiger. I did some of these exercises, I'd go and howl, but like purely, and you had to risk being caught at least. So that you would be able to overcome your fear to just release yourself into something raw and primal. So he'd have you make all these animal sounds. You think, my goodness me, this guy's a trial lawyer and he's getting me to make animal noises. How does this work? So I'd been kind of like, I think around a similar time exposed to that stuff as well. And my mind was very much in it. So I just was in that zone. And that's why I did what I did. It wasn't a choice to do that instead of linguistically arguing. But I don't think there's anything I could have said to that guy that would have had him write that ticket off that he was already writing. I just really don't think there is. I think it had to just be nonverbal. I suspect a lot of the skills of a good hypnotist and a good trial lawyer, they're not too far apart. Or a good coach or a good orator or whatever. In the end, it seems to me that much of the work is about moving minds. It's about moving perceptions, experiences. It's about evoking different sensations, different frames. So I think there's a good argument to be made that says, well, good hypnosis is just good communication,
right? In
some ways. And some people might go, oh, no, it's more than that. It's okay, yeah, but it's what you do with that communication. So obviously, if you're formally a hypnotist, you're going to do much more obvious trancey stuff that sits with that frame. But you'll still be using the same skills as if you were delivering an oration in front of a room, a keynote that you really wanted to have an impact with. Your outcomes are different, but the communication skills are the same.
Yeah, in the film world, in the screenwriting world, if you want to get a job, most of your time is spent pitching your take on a story or what you want to do with it. And your pitch on how to get that job, your pitch on the story has nothing to do with the way you would actually write. If you're good at writing the words on the page, that is, are you good in a room selling someone on an idea? And I have friends who are incredibly talented writers who are terrible at pitching.
Right.
And so they don't get as many jobs as someone who can. And I think that translates to how much better, can you increase your results with this clients with your same hypnotic skills, but be a better presenter? Is there any kind of, like, say there's someone who is still earlier in, or has been doing things well for a while, but knows that they could step it up and perhaps is now considering, hey, maybe I can step it up in terms of my performance or showmanship. What would be some things to consider, or some like a interesting step they could take to think about showmanship or performance?
Right. I think the first thing is being willing to do it. It's just the willingness. And a lot of people have a block around performance, which is they feel uncomfortable being, quote unquote, who they're not. Like, this isn't me. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel comfortable. So for me, the aim is, number one, is to be willing to do it. Now, what you want to do is you want to be able to expand your repertoire of communication and performance so it becomes natural. So it won't feel right necessarily to start with. It won't feel like who you are. It will feel weird. It will feel awkward. It will feel clunky. And that's just fine. So there's one thing I used to teach people, which I called Shatnering. Have I ever talked to you this before, Shatnering?
I've heard you mention it, but go for it. I think you should. Okay. This is a good...
So Shatnering. So I always take William Shatner, as the model of this, because a lot of people mock William Shatner because they say he overacts. You look at him in his old Jim Kirk, damn it, Bones. He's just so over the top with everything. But I particularly love his musical excursions, like him doing Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds or Rocket Man, because he is so over the top in his acting. So if anyone hasn't seen these, go check these out on YouTube. So he'll be there doing, I can't even do this because I'm boxed in at the moment. You have to move your body to be able to do this. So I'm kind of boxed in my little booth. But he's there. He's like, picture yourself on a train in a station with plasticine people and looking glass ties. You know, it's over the top, ridiculously over the top, right? So I actually recommend that when people are uncomfortable, is that they Shatner. Now, I don't mean you sit down with your client and you Shatner. I don't mean that. I mean, take some time away and rehearse some things that you'd want to do in an over-the-top William Shatnerish kind of way. It doesn't mean you have to be like William Shatner. I just mean exaggerated. So I might be there going, how would it be for you now to go so deeply into this moment? Now, I might do something like that. That's Shatnered. It doesn't mean I'm going to deliver it with that kind of level of, that was a 8 out of 10 Shatner. I'm not necessarily going to go 8 out of 10 on the Shatner scale when I do that with the client. But when you get used to it, it sort of stretches you. And it creates a new normal, which will be toned back. It won't be all the way out there on the caricatured edges. It'll sit somewhere in the middle, but you'll have found that you grew beyond your previous communication patterns and styles. So sort of go beyond in private and let it relax back to a neutral space. That can be a really good thing. Now, another thing that I did a lot of back in the day, because I've got that big NLP influence, is I did a lot of modeling. So I would find people who I were like, oh yeah, they're great. They're a great performer or a great orator or whatever. And I would imitate them. Now, again, not necessarily when I'm working with a client, but I would take time out to imitate them. I would do what is sometimes called a deep trance association, but I suspect it's similar to a Stanislavski acting method. You just go in and you act as if you are that person. You feel like you're that person, whatever. You let it come alive from the inside out. So doing a lot of that stuff, I've done that with a lot of people over the years. I can even look at various stages of my development where I'm delivering training programs. I mentioned my friend James Sakalos earlier. There's videos I can go, oh, look, there's James Sakalos in me because I've modeled bits of him and how he does some things and modeled bits of other trainers. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because some people go, but that's not really me. Or who the heck are you anyway? Where does your personality come from in the first place? Is it genetically hardwired, or is it the result of a lot of modeling you did when you were a kid? So I listen to myself speak. I hear my dad a lot of the time. I hear my mom sometimes. I hear people that I grew up with. So I just modeled stuff from them. Who says you have to stop at a certain age? There's a certain point where you go, well, that's the real you. Steve Chandler, who I mentioned earlier, people say practice makes perfect. Steve used to say, no, it doesn't. Practice makes the unnatural natural.
Yeah. You stretch past, you do the slightly more extreme version in rehearsal, and then in practice in real life, you'll find the balance of the naturalness.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to tag on when you mentioned specifically mimicking people that were great at speaking. I've heard so many very famous, very successful stand-up comedians who all have the same story of they had their favorite comedy album when they were a kid and they literally memorized the bits and would perform it for their family using the same inflections and using the same tone of voice and literally just mimicking exactly. And they all separately now, as hugely successful professional comedians, sound nothing like those records.
Right.
But that was the beginning of them learning to be a performer through someone else's performance, through mimicking that, and then finding their own lane eventually.
Right. I think the reason that's valuable is because people forget we have two minds or two hemispheres. And one of those is about pattern recognition, which is always something that works at an implicit level. So if you say, you pick a comic who has great comic timing, even that phrase, their comic timing, fantastic comic timing. If you say, well, what does that mean, comic timing? Could you give detailed instructions on how to have good comic timing? No, nobody can. There isn't a person alive that can give you good instructions on here's how you do comic timing. So the only way people can pick up comic timing is through implicit learning, not explicit learning, not going, I've identified it. What you do is you say this word and you draw the end out, and then you leave a 3.5 second pause, and then with the eyebrow raised, that's never going to work, right? So it can only work implicitly. I can see that if you go, this comedian cracks me up, and you just learn their set, and you don't just learn the words, you learn the intonations, you learn the timings, you learn the beats. Now, you learn at a deeper level. Erickson would say at the level of the unconscious mind. You still don't know consciously what good timing is, but you know you've got it in the body. You've got it deep in the system. And it may be that you then evolve that timing with your own sensibilities and your own experience, but it gives you a fantastic starting point. So you're not bound up by that. I don't think there's any harm in copying, which in NLP is called modeling. It's the same. It's the same thing, really, at the end of the day. It's a valuable thing. And I've done this as a hypnotist. Again, I used to look at speakers that I loved. I used to be a performer as a mentalist as well. I would look at certain mentalists who I really liked. Now, Darren Brown was an example. At one point, I was very Darren Brown because I just copied his delivery style, everything like that. My second favorite mentalist is Richard Osterlind, who's a US mentalist, completely different vibe and style. So I did a lot of modeling at that time, and that influenced my approach to hypnosis. My modeling of Darren Brown influenced my approach to hypnosis. But then I would model other hypnotists who I liked. I'll just say this one last thing on this topic, and it's something that people miss. The pragmatics are wonderful, right? But aesthetics are valuable too. And I suspect that aesthetics are not entirely unpragmatic. So, sometimes you might go, I just love the way this person communicates. I just love the way they evoke this or they evoke that. When it comes to hypnotists, there are lots of hypnotists who are apparently effective, who I dislike the aesthetics of their performance. For me, it doesn't work, right? I just don't like it. So, and the reason I mention this is because when people say, oh, James, your hypnosis without trance stuff, all of this, do you do it that way because it's superior or this, that, and the other? And yeah, I could make arguments about, I think this works better than this because of this, pragmatics arguments. I can make those arguments, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit that aesthetics were a key part of what influenced me in doing hypnosis. So initially, when it comes to street hypnosis stuff I used to do, other hypnotists were doing things I was interested in doing. I just didn't like the way they did it. I thought the way they did it was corny or cliched or ugly. It just didn't fit my aesthetic sensibilities. So some of it's just changing things to fit my aesthetic sensibilities. Like, I'm aware that people can get great results hypnosis-wise, pulling someone's arm and going, sleep, deeper, 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 deeper. That's right. With every number that passes, you'll go 10,000 times deeper, 50,000 times deeper, 100,000 times deeper. And they can do that. And I've modeled their styles as well. But I don't like the aesthetics of it, but I probably still picked up some good things from it. So I think, again, looking at performance and art, hypnosis, change work, coaching, I'm not saying there's no science that applies, but it is more art and craft than science.
So, there you go. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you've never before considered utilizing a little bit of showmanship, a little bit of performance in the way you deliver the message that you have for your client, perhaps this opened up a little spark of interest for you. If you have thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at changeworkingpod@gmail.com. See you next time.
Changeworking is produced by Ruckus Sky. For information on training, go to clientshifts.com.